Hi, everyone. For those of you just tuning into these videos, this is Body Talk with Rachel, where I, along with special guests, talk about body image concerns among different groups. My name's Rachel. I am a doctoral intern at the Counseling Center, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm really excited to be joined today by three amazing contributors to the housing community, Doctors Brown, Cook, and Perryman. And together we're going to talk about body image concerns among Black women. So thank you all so much for being here today and the time and effort involved in doing this. Would you first like to introduce yourselves and share what led you to, be a part of this discussion? Whoever wants to go first.
I can go first.
Awesome.
So, hi, folks. My name is Liz. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a staff psychologist at the Counseling Center. And what led me to be part of this discussion was a big part of my research in graduate school was on Black women's ideal body image. Because as you'll find out throughout this talk, Black women's ideal body is often very different from the ideal body of white women. And so it requires that we think about things like body image and eating concerns differently. And so I was really excited to be a part of a talk that addresses that.
I'm Keiwana Perryman. I serve as the Associate Director in the Center for Student Diversity. I specifically focus on the support, advocacy, and programming for students who identify as part of the African diaspora. I was excited to join this conversation selfishly because I currently struggle with body image issues and concerns. And so I wanted to just hear what other people are thinking and get some advice, suggestions, but also to help me in my programming with the student population that I serve.
All right, I guess I chime in here. Hi, folks. My name is Danice Brown. I am an associate professor in the psychology department, specifically with the counseling psychology program, where I also serve as the coordinator of clinical training. And I also have a private practice in addition to that. I was excited to take part in this because a lot of the work that I do, particularly my research, is focused on messages that Black women receive about, what it means to be a Black woman, and some of those messages are related to various aspects of body image and appearance. But also in my own clinical practice, I primarily see a lot of Black women, and so concerns like this come up. So I'm just excited to be a part of the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to be part of this conversation too. And thanks so much for naming, Dr. P, that body image concerns are something that likely everyone deals with in some ways, and that we're all on journeys of, accepting aspects of our bodies too. I also want to name, my white identity in this space and the privilege I have with that identity. It's really a goal of mine to center the experiences of Black women, knowing that in body image work, so often Black women are viewed through the lens of white women's experiences. So I really don't want to maintain that here. I also want to point out that we're going to be talking about Black women's experiences generally, and there's no way that we'll be able to, touch on all of the unique experiences of Black women in this discussion. So keep that in mind as we talk about themes. They might not apply to everyone, especially when thinking about the interactions of different identities people have. The last point I want to make before we get started is that our discussion is going to be in two different videos. The first, we're going to, talk about these messages that Black women receive and how they impact their bodies. Then the second video is going to talk about the impact of these messages. And why they're separated is that we have more people in the conversation than in some of the other body talk videos. So just want to make space for everyone. I also think shorter videos can be a little more digestible for our viewers. So that was the goal there. So let's start off. So first, when I think of body concerns, I think about the role of society and culture on body concerns. And I want to start off just by naming that and hear some of your initial thoughts about how society and culture impact Black women's experiences with body concerns.
So I think one of the first important things to consider is that Black women are affected by the societal concerns in some ways from two different groups, right? So there's the mainstream culture that often has these Eurocentric body ideals of what an ideal woman looks like. And then there's these more Afrocentric or ideals that are more central to the Black community that affect what Black women's ideal body image looks like. And so, in trying to hold that, I think what's particularly interesting is that there's almost like this picking and choosing of which ideals or a melding of which ideals that contributes to what Black women see as their ideal body. And as a result, you have things like, for example, I recall in my research people saying things like, well, I wouldn't necessarily want to be white, but I do know that I was told having lighter skin is better, or I wouldn't want to have straight hair, but I know that having a looser curl pattern is better. So really this melding of these two different cultural ideals is a lot of what at least I've seen in some of the work I've done.
I would definitely agree with that in terms of navigating two very different environments and two very different spheres. But what I really like about what you said, Liz, is that when we typically talk about body image issues, it does tend to center on white women, and it is sort of this large focus really on like body size. But when you get to the complex and unique experiences of Black women and talking about body image issues, that is where you get elements of skin color pulled in and hair type pulled in, and not just sort of physique or body size. And I think that that's something important for folks to account for, because I can even remember being young and there were these standards that if you were like dark skinned, then you could be this body size with this type of hair, but if you were light skinned, you could be this body size with this, curl pattern, and just sort of the varying ways that skin color and hair type also factor into conversations about Black women's body image.
So I think, and I'm going to ask you to forgive me, my notes are on my other monitor. So if I'm looking away, I'm just looking at my notes. I think when you're saturated with body types from music videos, movies, even commercials, your mind really starts to begin to internalize some of these images, and it tricks you into thinking that you should look the same way. And as I share, this is very personal for me. So a lot of my responses are personal. Just thinking back, the only time that I have ever been comfortable in my own body is when I was pregnant. And that is when I felt free, because everybody kind of, they praise, a pregnant woman's body. And I appreciated the attention that my body was giving me, right? But outside of that, it just makes you think about like what images we're really internalizing and why, which I'm sure our conversations will kind of unpack that. But I definitely see that I don't necessarily see it as separating which part of society these images are, these concerns are coming from. Because for me, it impacts me all the same, regardless of where it's coming from. And if I'm being honest with myself, the biggest perpetrator in my life is actually my mother, and what that looks like for me. And I'd say more about that a little bit later.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point of like the messages are coming from different people and their impact could be more significant for some, but also the collective impact is what's important too. So I know we've hinted at some of these messages already, but what are some of these messages that are received and who do they come from?
I think what's really interesting about our current day and age is that you have the messages that come from family and friends and media, but you also have a lot of messages that come from social media. And in particular, with social media, people can, yes, curate their social media and their feeds so that they receive certain messages or certain images. But also, we've heard things like, TikTok taking down videos of darker skinned women or bigger women in lingerie, where maybe they didn't take down videos of thinner, lighter women in lingerie. And so, in addition to receiving those messages from different places, what is happening, I see often with social media is I think in some ways we're losing maybe some of that diversity that you got from media previously. So in a world where you may have seen a darker skinned woman, for example, on a TV commercial. If you look at someone's social media feed and top influencers, you're not necessarily going to see that, which I think is particularly interesting.
That is interesting to think about.
I think that when I think about the messages that folks receive, particularly from families and communities, I really think about the complexity and nuance of it. Because, when I think about this idea of Black women having a certain covering themselves in a certain way or not covering themselves, how your hair is put, I think about how, in some ways, these messages really started as a way for like Black communities and Black families to debunk these ideas about Black women, right? That Black women were Jezebels, that Black women couldn't operate in professional spheres. And even when I think about like my own grandmother, who would talk about, who constantly straightened her hair and would constantly sort of talk about like what you're wearing and how you present yourself. And it was really sort of how you present yourself to white folks, right? And sort of trying to prepare me to navigate these worlds, which on one hand felt very helpful, but also in another way, almost could feel like burdensome in terms of thinking about like, what do I look like and how am I presenting myself to folks and when do I actually get to feel comfortable in my own skin? And so I really sort of think about the paradox of that as how some of these messages sort of originated in this idea of trying to protect Black women from being projected in these images that could be harmful, but how the messages in and of themselves kind of then became harmful in terms of really limiting how a Black woman could see herself, how I could see myself. Yeah.
I totally agree. Like I said, my messages came from my mom, even my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. I recall her watching her get ready for bed at night, and she would put on her perfume and her red lipstick. Because she would say if something happened to her in the middle of the night, she wanted to look cute for the doctors. Or the things my mother would tell me, how I'm supposed to dress, what I'm supposed to wear. If I want to get a husband, I identify as heterosexual. If I want to get a husband, or like we've been in the pandemic, and for 186 of those days, I had 2 small toddlers here with me. By the time my husband comes home, I'm not thinking about my hair being done, right? But for my mother, it's always, well, you need to look a certain way because you want him to have something to come home to. And it's like, well, gee, can I look this way for me? Can I show my daughters that, they can look good for them? The saying is, if you look good, you feel good. And I'm trying to challenge that notion with my 2 girls. Like, no, if you feel good, then you look good. So I think for me, it's quite interesting that the struggles that I have, with body issues and body concerns is less from what I see out in the world, but what I see in my own home and how I was raised.
And in some ways, it's also hard to, there are certain messages that we, I think, have hinted at or already stated of, having lighter skin and looser curl patterns and having maybe an hourglass shape, not being too big or too small. But what's also interesting and something I think Danice hinted on is it's all kind of under this umbrella of respectability politics, right? And so in some ways it started as, oh, if we're going to like think about it from a socio-cultural and historical perspective, in some ways it's, if you have lighter skin, you don't have to work in the field, you're going to get to work in the house, you'll have better food, you'll be taken care of better, right? And in some ways, as that transitioned, it became, oh, if you have lighter skin, then you'll get to go to college, right? If we're talking about like the paper bag test. And then that eventually that became, okay, lighter skin is beautiful and better. And all of these different sort of like particular messages, there's a negotiation to each of them. So like Danice was saying, if you have darker skin, maybe you can't wear certain colors and you need to have a looser curl pattern. Or if you are bigger, then you need to have long hair and like light eyes. And in some ways, or even if you have a particular body size, or excuse me, it doesn't matter what your body size is, what really matters is your hair. And I think especially when we're talking about Black women, so much of body image is wrapped up in not actually our physical bodies, but our hair. And I think that may be a hard concept sometimes for people who are unfamiliar with the community to think about, because the sacrifices that Black women make for their hair physically can actually impact your health. Like, I don't know many Black women who don't have a story of like being injured or like incurring some sort of like battle scars from dealing with their hair. And that's just as important as, talking about other aspects of body image that affect your health particularly.
Yeah, and so I really appreciate what Liz, what you were saying in terms of like this idea of respectability politics. And Rachel, I know that it seems like we're going to come to this a little bit later, but I do feel like it needs to be said that this whole idea of respectability politics within Black communities, again, was largely about trying to ensure that Black children, that Black girls, that Black youth somehow fit within the context of a white supremacist society. Like, that is what respectability politics really came from. This idea of, if you act this way, if you dress this way, if you look this way, then you will be able to navigate these white spheres and be more successful. And so if we're going to talk about, the respectability politics that, a lot of our grandparents have sort of taken on, in all honesty, they took on those ideas about like straight hair out of this idea of wanting their kids and their grandkids to be able to navigate these white spaces that were not easily opened for them. And so I think that if we're going to have this conversation about body image and even what's happening within Black communities around body image, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that fact that it sort of falls under this umbrella of the ways in which white supremacist ideas and thought really influenced and impacted how Black families and Black communities thought it was appropriate or necessary to navigate, their kids and youth being in mainstream.
I know this is beyond the scope of our conversation, but at some point I'll be curious to hear folks' thoughts on how the Black church plays into that respectability politics and the messages that we get just about our womanhood in general from the church. That would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it sounds like that's an area where there's strong messages related to body and expectations of what a Black woman should look like or perhaps be like. Yeah. Yeah. So Dr. Brown, such a nice segue of the question, what's the impact of white supremacy on these messages? And it seems so clear based off all the comments so far that that can't be pieced apart completely, that the impact of white supremacy is there. And I think from things that I'm thinking about are, what that looks like and how the like different environments of a predominantly white environment versus a predominantly Black environment can have an impact on body image for different women. And really just your thoughts on other impacts of white supremacy on these messages.
Oh, go ahead, Liz. No, I was gonna say kind of to Keiwana's point is that on some level, because they become so intertwined, I don't know if you can always necessarily sparse out like predominantly white and predominantly Black, and you're only getting these messages in this area and only getting these messages in another area. And that's really because we have to account for the ways that like we as Black folks, as a Black community have internalized a lot of these messages, even so much so that we don't realize that, Keiwana, when you're talking about like, personal stories, I can remember, being a kid and like the thought of someone cutting my long hair was so devastating. And for the longest, I couldn't figure out why it felt like it would just completely ruin my life and that it had to be like completely straight. Until one day when I realized what it was, it like had nothing to do with what I wanted or how I felt about myself. It was how I thought people perceived me. It was because I was dark skinned, and dark skinned girls are only cute if they have long straight hair. And when I finally was willing to sort of let that go, it was life changing. And so that's what I mean. Like, I consider myself a relatively intelligent person, but I still even held on to that. And I know these things and I talk about these things, but still for the longest, it wasn't until I was in grad school that I said, it's time. Like, I have to let this go. It really is not serving me anymore. And so I think that in so many ways, they don't have to be separate spaces anymore. Like, we have internalized these messages so much that it doesn't matter whether I'm in a predominantly Black crowd or a predominantly white crowd. Like, the messages are just crossing crossing the lines, and they're just everywhere, whether we want to acknowledge them or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I get my hair done every 3 to 4 weeks. And I always find myself looking at my calendar to see what programs or meetings do I have coming up, which will dictate the style that I choose to get. Because I'm mindful of, if I show up with a certain type of hairstyle, how am I going to be perceived? Am I going to be taken seriously? How are my students going to look at me? And I can almost guarantee that the reaction and feedback from my students are completely different from that of colleagues that may not necessarily look like me. I'm thinking about what type of questions am I going to have to answer about my hair. Just something as simple as, oh, your hair grew. How did you get your hair to grow so fast? Or you changed your color. How often do you change your color? Just the versatility that Black women have with being creative with their hair. It just creates, I don't want to say undue, we have to put more energy and effort into explaining. When we are just trying to be ourselves, we wanted to get this particular hairstyle because it was cute. We wanted to see how it would look on us. But now I have to put all this extra energy and effort into justifying the choice that I made, which is tiring and taxing. But at the same time, I recognize that when my hair looks a certain way, that I am received differently, particularly with higher level administrators and not necessarily colleagues that are on the same level as I am, so to speak.
Yeah, it seems like there's greater attention to hair among Black women, and I'm like hearing that there's thought putting into what spaces you're in, like what meetings you have, and what hair you might, how you might style your hair for it. And I'm just wondering what those differences are. If you could elaborate a little more on if you feel comfortable sharing, or if anyone does.
Yeah, I think this actually ties into the point I was going to make earlier in terms of, when we think about white spaces and Black spaces, because of the melding or appropriation, or however you want to define it, a lot of times there's this, what I define as like a whitewashed exoticism that happens, in the sense of, you get things where people like black features on non-Black bodies, right? So the reason why people like Kim Kardashian are praised for having such a curvy figure, when to me, she doesn't look much different from like my family members, right? The reason why, folks like Beyonce can be praised, but if Beyonce was a few shades darker, she might not be seen in the same light. And so even when we think about hair, it's okay maybe to wear braids, right? Because again, we've seen people like the Kardashians wear braids and call them, I don't remember what name they called them. That's not a real name for what braids are called, but like Bo Derek braids, right? Instead of cornrows, which is what they are, right? So, there are some things I can wear like braids where my non-Black colleagues and white colleagues might be like, oh, your hair looks so nice, and be so fascinated. But if I wear a head wrap, which is equally as culturally Black, there's this like, what is going on? Like, are you suddenly militant? It's like you get fit into a different type of archetype sometimes, depending on how your hair is. And there are certain types of Black hairstyles that are acceptable and seen as like maybe being part of a normal Black person, or an acceptable, respectable one. Whereas other styles, it's like, I don't know what you're going to do. Do you hate white people? What's going on here? And I find that deeply interesting. Like Keiwana was saying, as a Black woman who like, some days I feel like wearing a wig, some days I wear a head wrap, some days I wear a twist. It just depends on like what popped up in my spirit that day. But I am conscious of like, what message are people going to receive? And do I have the energy to care and or deal with this?
And I appreciate what you both said about the energy, because I don't think that people account for like just the energy that goes in, the energy that goes into, not like, my hair is my hair, I'm gonna be fine, however, but to walk into a space and have to deal with the questions or the looks or the, I mean, sometimes the downright stares, and just even just sort of the emotional toll. I can remember, you know, the one day I did decide to show up to work and I had gotten my hair straightened. I don't do it often, so no one like really ever sees my hair straight. And I'm walking through the hall and I had like colleagues saying, "Oh my gosh, your hair is so amazing." And you have to stop and think about how that feels. I walk into this space every day and I think my outfits look pretty nice. But on the day I show up with the straightest hair possible, you look amazing. And it's just like, and I say thank you, but really I'm exhausted because my thought is I look amazing every day, but I didn't look amazing to you until I showed up like this day. And that is just emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, thanks so much for naming that emotional exhaustion. I appreciate you all sharing that. And I'm just, want to point out too the style that you pointed out being like white Eurocentric too, and if that has to do with some of that attention, like that straightening, like garners more attention and positive remarks.
I think what's particularly interesting is also this like fascination that happens. The way I put it is I can have a white friend walk in with pigtails one day, her hair straight the next day, and like a bun on top of her head the next day, and there are no questions about it, right? But I can walk in with a bun one day and flat twist like I have now. And it's suddenly this like, what is going on? And like, how did you do that? And it's so different. And this fascination is like part of this fetishizing. And I think that fetishizing is also what plays into what I called earlier, sort of this like whitewashed exoticism, this fetishizing of particular features that are seen as attractive on Black women, and just given to someone else. I think we try to talk about it in nice ways of appropriation. I'm like, it's fetishizing. That's what's happening here.
I'm just reflecting on the like unattainableness of that there are some attributes that are perceived favorably and not all are, and the just the negative impact that can have. So that kind of leads into another question, is that there was a survey I distributed to 1,000 students about their body image concerns. And I noticed this theme when I looked at their responses, that those who identified as Black women shared that they perceived that Black women are held to a much higher standard than others. And that seemed to ring true to me as I was reading that, but I was hoping to hear your impressions of that impact of both gender and race on Black women and their experiences with body image and that higher standard perception.
Well, I'll go first on this one, because this one is still stinging. So we're expected to cook, clean, comfort, care for all the people that's in our house, right? And then at work, we're expected to solve all the problems. I can share emails where the content of the email was just for your management and to be fixed. Like, I'm just one person. I know I'm supposed to be an expert in my particular area, but I'm not, right? I do not speak for all Black people on campus. I do not speak for all Black people in my family or in this world. I'm expected to solve all the Black problems on campus, right? But at the same time, I'm supposed to do it with style and grace. And then again, going back to this pandemic, you know, trying to navigate my own mental capacity with what seems to be the work seems to be so much greater when you're at home and there's no separation between work and home life. And I recall having a conversation with my mother, and I'm like, I just wish I had some help. You know, I wish my husband would step up a little bit more. And her response was, well, that's just the way it is, Kia. Like you're supposed to. Like you have to do what you have to do. And I'm like, help me make that make sense, because it doesn't. Like, we're in 2021. In my mind, in terms of gender, like we should be on equal playing fields, right? All parties should be equally contributing to the workforce, to the home, to the child rearing. But that's not the case, because my mother told me, which I assume her mother and her older sisters told her, and their parents told them, that this is just what women do. This is just Black women are naturally nurturing and caretakers, and we're just supposed to take care of everybody. And we typically leave ourselves last out of everybody. And so this is something that I'm definitely, again, still struggling with. But I don't necessarily see that play out in some of my white friends, you know, in their homes, in their work environments. That same expectation is not put on them. And I wonder why. I would really like to know why not. Okay.
I think in terms of that higher standard when it comes to body image and what Black women look like, it's similar to what Keiwana was saying, is something that often, at least the way I think about it, gets passed on from most of the times your mother and your aunties from their mothers and their aunties, right? And if I think about myself, for example, I hated skirts probably until I was like maybe 19, right? But when I began to work more on a full-time basis, and especially when I knew I was going to be in a place where I was going to be the only Black woman, let alone Black person, I found myself gravitating towards a style of professional wear that was much more formal than the other interns, the other practicum students. And that was similarly much more feminine than I might be in my like everyday life. And it didn't occur to me until I kept getting these comments of, you always look so nice with your heels and your blazers and your skirt, and even your eyeshadow matches the color of your blazers. And had to stop and think, I'm like, am I doing this because I really just like different color eyeshadow and blazers? Or am I doing this because I feel like I can't be caught slipping? Right. And so it goes back to this respectability politics, and really this idea of, you're a Black woman, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so that doesn't just mean turning in your notes on time and, you know, speaking articulately. It also means when you present your ideas, they cannot find fault with your physical appearance, because that will affect them hearing your ideas. And then they'll attribute that default not to you being a student, not to you learning, not to you being human, but because you being a Black woman and all of these negative attributes that are, you know, put on Black women. And so in some ways you can't disconnect it, because while we'd like to think, oh, I could show up in maybe the combat boots, literally combat boots that one of my fellow interns, you know, showed up in, and both of our ideas be taken as valid. But in my heart of hearts, I knew that that wasn't true, and that I could not dress the same as she did, my white colleague. So.
I appreciate what you said, Liz, about you can't be caught slipping, because that is the realest statement ever. Like, even thinking about my own experience when I took my first academic job, now almost 14 years ago, and I remember on the first day of class, who, as my husband can attest to, I own heels, but they really just for show. I don't really like them. And I like had on heels, and I had on a skirt, and I showed up on the first day of class, and I still remember another colleague, a white woman, she showed up with her hair and like the messy bun is what I'm told it's called. and a sweatsuit, like a tracksuit and sneakers. And I was like, oh, are you not teaching today? And she was like, yeah, no, I just taught my first class. And she's like, well, look at you looking all fancy. And I was like, okay, all right. But here's the thing. On the day that I showed up, now it was maybe 6 years from that first day when I was still at that university. And I showed up in a hoodie and some jeans and a pair of Adidas ready to teach my early morning class. I literally had that same colleague ask me if something was wrong. And then I had other colleagues ask me if something was wrong. And I was like, no. And they were like, oh, were you in a rush this morning? No, no. Are we not? Is this not the day we all wear sweatsuits? It was like just this idea that I always had to have it together. I always had to keep it together. And if I didn't have it together, there was something wrong with me on that day, because how dare I not have it together? I mean, I think that is the whole idea. You can't be caught slipping, because it's like folks are waiting for it. It's like you could have said something to me at any moment, but you waited for this day when I showed up, actually dressed even a little bit better than the tracksuit you had on 6 years ago. But this is the day you decide to check in on me to make sure that I'm okay. That's reflective of something.
Yeah, it just feels so incredibly unfair and disproportionate to think that white women are really privileged with having like relaxed wear and relaxed days, and that not to be perceived negatively upon them.
And even to some extent, I think, especially if we're thinking about where these messages come from and how they come from our mothers and our aunties. Keiwana earlier was talking about the Black church. In some ways, the way I learned to dress professionally was through the Black church, right? And something we've seen, if we again think about it from a socio-historical perspective, is that the Black church is one that has been particularly involved with politics and the public sphere. And so for many of us, it's this respectability and idea about our bodies and what our bodies should look in public places comes from the church. The church, the Black church, was the first public place that you learned how to dress, right? And again, not something that occurred to me until I got older, and I was like, you're wearing the same things to work that you wear to church. And so again, this respectability politics, this idea of, in some ways, we want to be presentable to white folks just in case they're watching or they come across us, is really where that comes from.
Yeah, and not just that we want to be presentable to white folks, but again, this idea of sort of putting this pressure on young Black girls to debunk this idea of the Black Jezebel, of this sort of promiscuous Black woman. And so you keep yourself covered. And when I think about like my own experiences in the Black church, like it was this idea that you dress this way so that folks don't think that you're too available or too loose, right? And all of these ideas that sort of come along with that, ideas that honestly were even passed down to them that they may not have even completely understood, but we don't often have the conversation about how it all plays into, again, respectability politics, which plays into white supremacist ideas about Black women and their bodies and their body image. Yeah.
I definitely recall several messages. Just thinking about the church and the workforce. If you stand up, your skirt has to fall below your middle finger because that's the longest finger on your body, right? On your hand. And so if your skirt don't meet your middle finger, it's too short. But then I would think about when I first started my professional journey, and I will always wear either a dress or skirts because my grandmother told me that women didn't wear pants. Side note, I wore pants to church the Sunday after her funeral, and I felt so liberated and comfortable just sitting there. But I remember one of my colleagues, she came to work, and the short was beyond short. It probably came up to her mid thigh, and she had on these low pumps. And I'm just like, that's so short. You can't even, sit comfortably. You can't cross your legs. at your ankles, because that's where you cross your leg. That's how young ladies cross their legs. And I'm just thinking about all these things, the deaconesses of the church taught me that I'm now seeing in my professional world, and it's not making sense anymore. Everything that I was taught just doesn't make sense. And so now I have to figure out how to hold on to those messages, but then also kind of figure it out myself and I guess rebel and do my own thing. And sometimes it works, sometimes it's different. But I think it's interesting, Liz, the parallel between the two, the church and workforce, and how that still plays out even today.
Yeah, that is really an interesting point that I wasn't familiar with before we talked about this. And I think also a really interesting point of that these messages are, transmitted almost like subconsciously in some ways, that we can be transmitting them ourselves and we're listening to them based off of forces maybe beyond individuals ourselves. And that component of it is really interesting as we segue into the next video of the impact of these messages and maybe some strategies to like combat these messages in some ways. So for those watching, this concludes the first video. In the next video, we're going to talk about the impact on these messages.